The Intergalactic Council of Artistic Supremacy occupied the most ostentatiously decorated space station in the known universe, where every surface gleamed with crystalline formations that supposedly channeled pure aesthetic energy. Whatever that meant, the council members, 12 species of beings who had collectively convinced themselves they were the arbiters of all things beautiful, sat in their floating meditation pods, each designed to accommodate their particular anatomical quirks, while projecting an aura of insufferable sophistication. At the head of this circus of cosmic pretension floated Wigxander the Magnificent, the Xantharian whose translucent skull housed what he claimed was the most refined artistic consciousness in 17 galaxies. His 4 eyes, each capable of perceiving light spectrums that would give lesser beings migraines, swept across the assembled council with the sort of disdain usually reserved for discovering mold in one's morning nutrition paste. "Fellow arbiters of galactic culture," Wigxander intoned, his voice resonating through the chamber's acoustically perfect dome, "we gather today to address a most amusing proposition." The way he said amusing suggested he found it about as entertaining as watching paint dry, which, given their current topic, was perhaps more ironic than he realized. Fluctus Prime, whose gelatinous form rippled with petters that somehow conveyed extreme intellectual superiority, pulsed with what the translation matrix interpreted as polite interest. "Proceed, Wigxander. Though I confess, after witnessing the Andromedan's attempt at temporal sculpture last cycle, I'm prepared for disappointment." The collective chuckle that followed this observation would have registered on seismic equipment. These beings, who had spent millennia perfecting art forms that required three-dimensional mathematics just to appreciate properly, were about to discuss something that would challenge every assumption they'd ever made about creativity, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of perception itself. Of course, they had no idea about any of that yet. Wigxander activated the central display, which materialized a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with pulsing indicators marking various civilizations. The question before us today concerns precognitive artistry, the theoretical ability to create visual representations of events before they occur. Our preliminary analysis suggests this may be possible, though obviously limited to species with sufficiently advanced neural architecture and sensory apparatus. A chorus of agreement rippled through the chamber. After all, these were beings whose eyes could see through time itself, or so they claimed in their more pompous moments. Their art installations routinely bent space-time into aesthetically pleasing knots. The idea that artistic vision might extend into the future seemed logical enough, provided it was attempted by appropriately evolved intellects. Hexamar the Profound, whose crystalline form refracted light in patterns that supposedly induced transcendent experiences in viewers, chimed with harmonic frequencies that translated roughly to smug certainty. Naturally, such abilities would manifest only in species that have achieved proper aesthetic enlightenment. The temporal arts require not just advanced optics, but consciousness refined through millennia of cultural evolution. Precisely, Wigxander continued, his satisfaction evident in the way his neural crown glowed. "We propose to conduct a comprehensive survey, beginning with the most promising civilizations and working our way down." He paused, consulting his notes with theatrical precision. The more primitive examples. The display zoomed in on various sectors, highlighting species whose artistic achievements met the Council's exacting standards. The Void Weavers, who painted with controlled black hole. The Chronosculptors, who carved monuments that existed in multiple time streams simultaneously. The Quantumists, whose masterpieces existed in probabilistic superposition until observed. Then, almost as an afterthought, the display panned to a small, unremarkable spiral galaxy on the outer rim of civilized space. A tiny blue-green world appeared, labeled with coordinates and a designation that seemed almost apologetic: Terra, human occupied. Fluctus Prime's form quivered with what might charitably be called amusement. "Surely you don't intend to include these humans in serious consideration?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell at a diplomatic dinner. Humans, those bipedal mammals who had barely mastered interstellar travel, whose idea of high art involved applying pigmented liquids to flat surfaces with primitive brushes. They possessed exactly 2 eyes, both limited to a narrow spectrum of visible light, and brains that hadn't even figured out how to properly interface with quantum consciousness matrices. Protocol demands we examine all sentient species, regardless of their developmental limitations. Besides, Their inevitable failure will serve as an excellent baseline for comparison. The collective sigh that followed could have powered a small space station. Here they were, beings who had transcended physical form in pursuit of artistic perfection, forced by their own thoroughness to consider whether creatures who still used primitive optical organs could possibly achieve precognitive artistry. Very well, Hexamar resonated with the harmonic equivalent of resigned patience, though I suspect we'll find their attempts as aesthetically primitive as their understanding of higher dimensional beauty. Their paintings lack even basic temporal coherence. What none of them knew, what their advanced sensors and sophisticated analytical equipment couldn't detect, was that somewhere on that insignificant little planet, in a modest dwelling that wouldn't register on their cultural significance meters, a young woman was running her fingers across a canvas, feeling shapes and patterns that hadn't happened yet. But that revelation would have to wait. For now, the Intergalactic Council of Artistic Supremacy was content in their certainty that true artistic vision required the most advanced evolutionary development the universe had to offer. They were about to discover just how wrong superior beings could be. Meanwhile, on the third planet of an unremarkable solar system that the galactic positioning charts dismissively labeled as Sector 7G, primitive life forms present. A young woman sat cross-legged on her studio floor, completely unaware that she was about to become the universe's most inconvenient discovery. Her fingers moved across the canvas, with the confidence of someone who had never relied on sight to navigate the world. 23 years of blindness had taught her that reality existed in dimensions most people never bothered to explore. Texture, temperature, the way paint felt when it was still wet with possibility. The subtle vibrations that seemed to emanate from colors she'd never seen but somehow understood completely. The canvas beneath her hands was already alive with swirls and shapes that defied conventional artistic logic. Where other painters might sketch outlines or plan compositions, she simply knew. Her brush found its way to exactly the right spot, applying pressure that created forms she couldn't see but felt with absolute certainty belonged precisely where she placed them. Another masterpiece of cosmic importance, I'm sure, she muttered to herself. A habit developed over years of providing her own commentary, because clearly what the universe needs is more abstract expressionism from the girl who paints by brain. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that her latest painting depicted the exact moment when the Andromedian trade fleet would experience a catastrophic navigation failure in 3 days' time. The swirling blues and angry reds on her canvas matched perfectly the sensor readings that wouldn't be recorded for another 72 hours. The irony was delicious. Here was someone who had never seen a sunrise painting tomorrow's solar storm with perfect accuracy, while halfway across the galaxy, beings with eyes that could perceive 17 different spectrums of light were preparing to explain why such a thing was impossible. The cosmic comedy reached its peak when Wixander's inspection drone materialized in Earth's atmosphere, its sensors already calibrated for disappointment. The device, roughly the size of a small shuttle, and equipped with enough analytical equipment to evaluate the artistic merit of an entire civilization, descended toward the planet's surface, with the sort of resigned efficiency usually reserved for unpleasant, but necessary tasks. Beginning cultural assessment of species designation, human. The drone announced to no one in particular, its voice carrying the same enthusiasm one might reserve for cleaning waste disposal units. Preliminary scans indicate widespread use of primitive pigment application technique. Artistic sophistication level embarrassingly basic. The drone's sensors swept across major population centers, cataloging thousands of artworks with the mechanical precision of a being that had never experienced beauty without first running it through 17 different analytical algorithms. Paintings, sculptures, digital installations, all of it neatly categorized and filed under quaint but ultimately meaningless. Then it found her. The first indication that something was wrong came when the drone's temporal analysis matrix started producing results that violated several fundamental laws of causality. The machine's sophisticated AI, which had successfully evaluated the artistic merit of 47 different civilizations, suddenly found itself staring at readings that made about as much sense as a philosophy lecture delivered by a caffeinated squirrel. Error in temporal coherence analysis, the drone muttered, running the scan again. Same result, The paint on the canvas contained trace elements that wouldn't be available in this solar system for another 3 days. The electromagnetic signature of the artwork matched energy patterns that existed only in theoretical models. Most disturbingly, the composition depicted events that the drone's own predictive algorithms confirmed had a 97.3% probability of occurring in the future. This is highly irregular. The drone observed its voice taking on the sort of confused tone usually reserved for machines discovering they've developed feelings. Initiating enhanced analysis protocol. Inside her modest studio, the artist continued painting, blissfully unaware that she was currently breaking several cosmic laws while simultaneously giving an advanced AI something resembling an existential crisis. Her brush moved with practiced ease, adding details to a scene that wouldn't exist until next week, a massive stellar phenomenon that would be visible from 17 different star systems, and require 3 separate scientific committees to properly categorize. The drone's sensors went into overdrive, scanning everything from quantum fluctuations to probability matrices. Every analysis came back with the same impossible conclusion. This primitive human, using tools that wouldn't qualify as advanced technology in most civilizations' agricultural sectors, was somehow painting tomorrow's reality with casual precision. Perhaps there's been a calibration error, the drone said to itself, because even artificial intelligences sometimes needed to talk through problems that challenged their core programming. Humans cannot possibly possess precognitive artistic ability. They lack the necessary neural architecture, sensory apparatus, and cultural sophistication. The painting disagreed. By the time the drone transmitted its preliminary report back to the Intergalactic Council of Artistic Supremacy, its confidence in the fundamental order of the universe had been thoroughly shaken. The message it sent was a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. Human artistic assessment requires immediate council review. Possible anomalous readings detect. What it really meant was the impossible is happening in a suburban art studio, and I have no idea how to explain it without sounding like my logic circuits have been replaced with abstract poetry. Back on the space station, Wigxander received this transmission with the sort of bemused irritation typically reserved for subordinates who reported seeing dancing furniture. Clearly the drone's systems needed recalibration. After all, the idea that humans could achieve precognitive artistry was about as likely as discovering that black holes were actually cosmic art installations created by a particularly avant-garde civilization. Some discoveries, however, have a way of being true regardless of how inconvenient they are for one's worldview. The emergency session of the Intergalactic Council of Artistic Supremacy, convened with the sort of urgency usually reserved for galactic wars, or the discovery that someone had been serving synthetic wine at diplomatic function. Wigxander's 4 eyes were practically vibrating with indignation, as he reviewed the drone's impossible data for the 17th time, each analysis more bewildering than the last. "This is clearly a malfunction," he declared, though his voice carried the subtle uncertainty of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "No primitive species could possibly. The temporal analysis has been verified by 3 independent systems," Fluctus Prime interrupted, his gelatinous form rippling with what the translation matrix generously interpreted as scientific concern, but looked suspiciously like panic. "The human's artwork contains accurate depictions of events that haven't occurred yet, events that our own predictive models confirm will happen." Hexamar's crystalline resonance took on the harmonic equivalent of someone clearing their throat, awkwardly. "Perhaps we should observe this phenomenon directly, for scientific purposes, naturally." The suggestion hung in the air like a confession of incompetence. Here were beings who had spent millennia mastering art forms that required advanced mathematics to appreciate, and they were proposing to personally investigate whether a bipedal mammal with primitive optical equipment could outperform their most sophisticated prediction algorithm. "Fine," Wigxander announced with the resignation of someone agreeing to attend their own execution. "Bring the human here. We'll conduct a proper demonstration under controlled conditions. When this proves to be an elaborate coincidence, we can file the appropriate reports and return to serious artistic endeavors." The extraction team that arrived on Earth consisted of 3 beings whose combined technological sophistication could have terraformed a small moon, yet they approached their target with the nervous energy of students about to take an exam they hadn't studied for. They found the artist in her studio, surrounded by canvases that depicted impossible things with casual accuracy. "Greetings, primitive life form," announced the team leader, whose name was approximately 47 syllables long, and roughly translated to, "He who brings enlightenment to those who lack proper aesthetic understanding. You have been selected for a singular honor." The artist paused in her work, brush still poised above a canvas that showed what appeared to be a nebula giving birth to twin stars, an event scheduled to occur next Thursday. "Well, that's not ominous at all," she muttered. "Let me guess, Galactic art credit." The translation matrix struggled with her sarcasm for a moment before settling on expression of gratitude with possible religious overtones. 24 hours later she found herself standing in the most opulent space station in known existence, surrounded by beings whose appearance suggested someone had gotten creative with geometric shapes and consciousness. The central chamber's crystalline surfaces reflected her image in ways that defied several laws of physics, while floating platforms carried creatures that looked like they'd been designed by committee. "Behold," Wigxander announced with theatrical grandeur, "the primitive human who claims to possess precognitive artistic abilities." "I never claimed anything," she pointed out reasonably. "You people kidnapped me from my studio because you're apparently having some kind of cosmic art crisis." The translation matrix rendered this as humble expression of readiness to serve the greater galactic good. "The demonstration is simple," Wigxander continued, gesturing toward a massive blank canvas that materialized in the chamber's center. "Paint tomorrow's most significant galactic event. You have one standard temporal unit, and what exactly counts as significant?" she asked, running her fingers across the canvas to get a feel for its texture. "Because my definition might differ from yours. For instance, I think it's pretty significant that you've built a space station that feels like it's compensating for something." This time the translation matrix simply gave up and displayed an error message. The assembled council members positioned themselves around the chamber, with the sort of eager anticipation usually reserved for watching someone attempt an obviously impossible task. Their various sensory organs, eyes, neural crowns, probability detection matrices, all focused on the human who was currently treating their most sacred artistic ritual like a mildly inconvenient interruption to her day. "Your monitoring equipment is giving me a headache," she announced, pressing her fingers to her temples. "All that quantum buzzing, could you maybe dial it back a notch?" The council members exchanged glances that somehow conveyed mutual bewilderment across species barriers. She was detecting their quantum sensors. "Those operated on frequencies that required specialized equipment to even register." "Begin," Wigxander commanded, his patience wearing thinner than atmosphere at high altitude. She shrugged and picked up her brush. What followed was perhaps the most scientifically documented impossibility in galactic history. Every sensor in the chamber recorded her movements with precise detail, tracking brush strokes that seemed to follow patterns that existed in 11 dimensions. Her paint choices made no logical sense. Colors that shouldn't work together somehow created harmonious compositions that registered on equipment designed to measure aesthetic beauty itself. But it was the content of her painting that really sent the council into collective awe. She painted with absolute confidence, creating scenes that their most advanced simulation matrices confirmed had zero probability of occurring, until the moment she painted them, at which point the probability suddenly spiked to near certainty. "This is theoretically impossible," Fluctus Prime observed, his form oscillating between states of being that suggested severe intellectual distress. "Tell me about it," she replied, adding a splash of color that somehow depicted the exact moment when the Centauri system would experience an unexpected aurora phenomenon. "I've been doing impossible things my whole life. You get used to." The painting grew under her hands like a living thing, each stroke revealing events that wouldn't happen for hours yet registered on their temporal sensors as foregone conclusion. A cosmic phenomenon here, a diplomatic breakthrough there, the discovery of a new form of crystalline life in the outer rim, all of it flowing from her brush with the casual ease of someone sketching from memory. Hexamar's harmonic frequencies had degraded into what could only be described as electronic whimpering. She paused, considering the question with the sort of thoughtful expression that suggested she'd never really analyzed her own process before. "I don't see the way you do," she said finally. "Maybe that's why I can see the way you can't." The philosophical implications of this statement hit the assembled council like a metaphysical freight train traveling at the speed of enlightenment. The moment her brush lifted from the canvas for the final time, reality decided to have a sense of humor. Across 17 star systems, the events depicted in her painting began manifesting with the sort of cosmic timing that suggested the universe itself had been waiting for this particular punchline. The Centauri aurora bloomed exactly as painted, its ethereal tendrils dancing through space in patterns that matched her brushstrokes with mathematical precision. The binary star birth in the outer rim commenced right on schedule, spawning twin suns that emerged from their stellar nursery like cosmic newborns following a predetermined script. The most sophisticated civilization monitoring systems in the galaxy suddenly found themselves recording phenomena that a blind human with primitive tools had predicted 12 hours in advance. "Impossible," Wigzander whispered, though his voice carried all the conviction of someone trying to argue with gravity. His four eyes were performing optical gymnastics as they tracked between the painting and the real-time galactic data streams that confirmed every impossible detail. Fluctus Prime had achieved a state of gelatin-like paralysis that his species typically reserved for profound existential crises. The probability matrices they're rewriting themselves. Events that shouldn't happen are happening because she painted them or she interjected with the sort of casual wisdom that tends to shatter worldviews. "Maybe I painted them because they were already going to happen. Your fancy equipment measures what is, not what will be. There's a difference." The distinction hit the assembled council like a philosophical meteor. These beings had spent millennia developing technology that could analyze, predict, and manipulate reality itself. Yet none of them had considered that perhaps the future existed in dimensions their advanced consciousness couldn't access. Heximar's crystalline form was resonating at frequencies that translated roughly to "does not compute" in 17 different languages. But how do you access temporal data without quantum consciousness matrices? How do you perceive probability streams without dimensional sensor? She shrugged, cleaning paint from her fingers with movements that somehow seemed more profound than they should have been. "I don't know how you see colors, but that doesn't stop colors from existing. Maybe the future touches everything, and most people are just too busy looking with their eyes to feel it with anything else." The council chamber fell into the sort of silence usually reserved for the moments before civilizations realize they've been fundamentally wrong about everything. Around them, monitoring equipment continued recording impossible readings while their most advanced theoretical frameworks crumbled like badly constructed sand castles. "This cannot be," declared Wigzander, though he was beginning to sound like someone arguing with the sunrise. "Precognitive artistry requires advanced neural architecture, sophisticated sensory apparatus, evolutionary refinement." "Does it?" she asked, settling cross-legged on the crystalline floor with the sort of comfortable confidence that suggested she found pretentious space stations about as intimidating as a particularly loud library. "Or maybe it just requires not being so convinced you already know how everything works." The philosophical implications were cascading through the chamber like dominoes made of pure enlightenment. Species that had achieved consciousness transcendence were being lectured on the nature of perception by someone whose primary technological achievement was mixing pigments in interesting ways. Fluctus Prime managed to achieve enough molecular cohesion to form words. But surely there must be some explanation. Some scientific principle we've overlooked. "There probably is," she agreed cheerfully. "But here's the thing about explanations. They're what you create after you understand something, not before. You've been trying to build understanding out of explanations, which is like trying to paint a picture by analyzing the chemical composition of paint." Around the chamber, various alien dignities were experiencing what could charitably be called learning moments and more accurately described as complete cognitive meltdown. Beings who had mastered arts that required three-dimensional mathematics were discovering that perhaps the most advanced technique was simply not overthinking everything. "Furthermore," she continued, apparently warming to her theme, "you keep talking about primitive this and advanced that, but maybe you're measuring the wrong things. I can't see light, but I can feel tomorrow. You can see across 17 dimensions, but you missed what was right in front of you. Who's really more advanced?" The question hung in the air like an accusation made of pure logic. Wigxander's neural crown was flickering with patterns that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid and involuntary renovation. Are you suggesting that sensory limitation actually enhances cognitive capability? I'm suggesting that maybe when you can't rely on one thing, you get better at relying on everything else. When you can't see what is, you learn to feel what could be. When you stop trying to control the future, you start being able to touch it. The monitoring equipment was still dutifully recording galactic events that continued unfolding exactly as her painting had predicted. Every measurement confirmed that somehow, impossibly, a species that hadn't even figured out faster than light travel had achieved something that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy considered theoretically impossible. So what happens now? Hexamar managed to ask, his harmonic frequencies wobbling like a badly tuned instrument. She stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her clothes with the sort of casual gesture that somehow conveyed complete indifference to galactic significance. Now I go home and paint some more pictures. Maybe next time I'll paint something really impossible, like all of you admitting you don't know everything. The cosmic irony was almost too perfect. The Intergalactic Council of Artistic Supremacy, whose members had spent eons convinced that true artistic vision required the most sophisticated consciousness evolution could produce, had just been schooled by someone whose artistic technique could be summed up as touch things and hope for the best. As the extraction team prepared to return her to Earth, the council members sat in their floating meditation pods, grappling with the sort of humility that comes from discovering the universe has a sense of humor and you're the punchline. Perhaps Fluctus Prime ventured with the careful tone of someone testing a radical hypothesis. We should reconsider our assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and actual understanding. Perhaps Wigxander agreed, though he sounded like someone admitting they'd been wrong about the fundamental nature of reality. We should. The young artist was already halfway back to Earth before the full implications hit them. Somewhere in the galaxy, the most advanced civilizations were scrambling to redesign their entire approach to consciousness, art, and the nature of perception itself. Meanwhile, in a modest studio on an unremarkable planet, she was back to painting tomorrow's weather, completely unaware that she'd just triggered the greatest philosophical revolution in galactic history. Because sometimes the most profound truths come not from those who can see everything, but from those who have learned to feel what others cannot see. And sometimes the future belongs not to those who can predict it with machines, but to those who can touch it with their heart. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting a very long time to teach that particular lesson to some very superior beings who had forgotten how to listen.